Okay, so right from the jump, this video hits you with that classic car trip energy. You know the one where everyone's a little bit underprepared, a lot excited, and convinced that borrowing wheels and wrestling with budget winter tires counts as proper planning. And honestly, I love that honesty because it sets the tone. This isn't a showroom review. It's a messy human adventure where the 812 is the glory object and the logistics are the comedy, which means you're already invested before the engine even fires. And you gotta admit, there's something fun about watching four grown adults try to make winter tires work on a supercar, like they're MacGyvering a ski holiday out of scrap metal and optimism. And here's the thing, that tone does two really good things. It makes the subsequent mechanical fragility feel real and suspenseful instead of staged. And it gives the whole film a personality that papers over a bunch of production shortcomings that otherwise would have left it feeling flat. So whether you're into cars for the sound, the technical rebuild drama, or just the people being themselves, that first little stretch sells the trip and makes you want to see if this mad plan actually survives the Alps. Then, you get the Channel Tunnel bit, and the film moves into proper road trip territory where the pace relaxes, and we start to learn the little personalities. Liam's brash R8 voice, Matt's chill but doomed Huracan swagger, and our narrator practically gushing about how the 812 behaved after a 54-hour rebuild. And I really liked how those first on-the-road minutes function as both setup and character work, because the cars are characters too. They each have their flaws and bragging rights, and that creates a natural tension without needing contrived edits. But also look, the tunnel sequence makes you feel the long haul ahead, which builds stakes nicely. So when the labor mechanical soap operas hit, you actually care about whose engine is going to cry first. And here's where the film starts to square up to its own limitations in a charming way. Testing the 812 after a 54-hour rebuild is the kind of thing that reads like a stunt, but feels very human on camera because you can literally hear the faint oily smell. You hear the idle struggles, and they talk through vacuum lines and fault codes in plain English, which is actually helpful for people who like the nuts and bolts. Yet the editing never bogs you down in jargon. It keeps it in that conversational lane, so the technical risk feels accessible instead of alienating. So when the narrator admits that the more he drives, the more the fault seems to clear up, you believe him, because the camera isn't trying to sell perfection. It's selling the drama of an imperfect car soldiering on. And in motor videos, that's a rare and satisfying thing to watch. Fast forward to the fuel stop banter, and you get this lovely tiny slice of human detail. Talking miles per gallon while two supercars strategize fuel like it's a competitive sport is goofy and grounding at the same time. And I gotta say it works, because it keeps the film from turning into an overblown hero worship piece about horsepower, and instead reminds you these are expensive toys that still have to eat. And that's all almost throwaway comparison where the Huracan does better MPG than the R8, but the 296 somehow earns bragging rights later. It's the kind of texture that makes the three-car dynamic feel lived in. Plus, it lets the creator casually flex knowledge about driving efficiency without getting preachy, which is exactly the tone this channel nails when it's being its most human and least performative. There's a quick comedic beat when the Huracan throws an engine light, and the solution is literally turning the car off and back on again. And honestly, that made me laugh, because it reminded me that cars are glorified temperamental appliances, and sometimes that's literally the fix. But the thing that matters editorially is how the video handles those moments. This one gets a brief comedic pause, a little tension, and then release, which is the exact pacing trick you want to employ in a long road film, so the audience gets tiny peaks of drama between the bigger, meatier incidents. And I liked that they didn't waste time over explaining it. They moved on, but not before giving the viewer a tiny hit of vulnerability, which helps when the later Fox incident kicks the tone into something much darker. Now let's talk about the real Vroom movie joy of the piece, which is the motorway cruising and the narrator falling in love with the 812 as a GT. And look, you can feel the enthusiasm in the voice. He calls it probably the best GT car so far, and you believe him, because the footage matches. Roomy interior, relatively quiet cabin despite being a V12, and that glorious exhaust note that the edit leans into in all the right places. But here's my critique. The audio mix sometimes favors the in-cabin banter over the raw engine. So there are moments when you wish the sound design would let the car do the talking by itself for longer. so you can properly luxuriate in it. Yet even with that, the clip does an excellent job selling the 812 as the sentimental center of the trip, and it makes the subsequent mechanical and emotional beats resonate, because we've been invited to root for this particular car. And then there's the sporty ego duel with Liam, which is honestly one of my favorite little narrative tricks they use because it introduces a tiny competitive subplot. Who's quicker, the V12 or the V10? And it stays fun because they keep it human. Rev ranges, excuses about being in the wrong power band, playful jabs. But the way the shots cut between exhaust barks and the driver's faces is where the creator's editing actually shines. It keeps tension tight and never takes itself too seriously. Although, full disclosure, I wanted just one more clean onboard pull where the 812 gets to stretch properly so we could settle the debate conclusively. But the indecision and the rematch attempts are themselves kind of charming and fit the video's loose, honest vibe. Okay, now we hit the hard part. The Fox collision with the Huracan is genuinely upsetting to watch, and the video handles it in a way that feels real and messy. There's confusion, silence, steam, and everybody's faces say it all. And I want to give credit where it's due, because the crew doesn't try to sugarcoat it or turn it into a cheap reaction moment. They slow down, they show the damage, and you get the sense that this isn't staged and that real responsibility and empathy are in play. But you also have to accept that this is a risky part of car content. Mounting cars on public roads at speed invites danger to wildlife and people. And while the incident was accidental, the sequence is a reminder that road trip videos need to balance spectacle with respect, which this one mostly does by showing the emotional fallout rather than making it a punchline. Following that chaos, the limping to safety stretch where the Huracan gets shepherded toward a service area and eventually abandoned overnight is both tense and oddly cinematic, with the group doing that triage dance, watching coolant temps, praying the oil stays safe, and talking through limp home tactics. And this is the kind of content that gives car videos their backbone, because it's not about flexing a car's perfection. It's about problem solving under pressure, which is fascinating to watch and educational if you care about the maintenance side. But I do want to point out that the footage occasionally leans too heavily on handheld shakiness and long silent panning, which, while atmospheric, sometimes makes the narrative momentum stall a bit. So my preference would have been for a tighter mix of technical explanation and calm visuals to keep the viewer's anxiety engaged without feeling lost in the gloom. But then, to the film's credit, we get a proper payoff in the next act. The alpine driving and mountain road sequence is exactly why people do trips like this. It's the reward after the mechanical anxiety, and the 812 genuinely sings in that environment. Sharp turns, cold air, and a soundtrack that makes you want to be in the driver's seat. And here the cinematography lifts things, because wide landscapes and thoughtful pacing let you breathe and appreciate the car with a cinematic sense of scale. Although I will say the color grade sometimes drifts toward an overly moody palette that flattens some details. But honestly, the emotional resonance of two friends sharing a brilliant mountain run at -7 degrees outweighs those small visual nitpicks, and is probably the most compelling single sequence in the whole piece. Then the Cullinan rescue and the car swap moment is a surprisingly lovely human beat, because it deflates the disaster without erasing it. The idea of rolling up with a flood-damaged Rolls-Royce as a reserve car is absurd and kind of perfect. And the footage where they're joking about replacing a supercar with an ultra-luxury SUV is a masterclass in tonal pivoting. We go from crash concern to ridiculous opulence, and somehow it lands because the crew are allowed to be ridiculous. But for a critical note, the narrative could have spent 5 more minutes showing the logistics of getting the Huracan trailered and how they arranged recovery, because those details would make the operation feel less like magic and more like responsible planning, which matters if the channel has any obligation to model safe behavior to its viewers. Morning reunion scenes where everyone finally makes it to the hotel and the camera gets to linger on faces instead of engines are quietly satisfying, because you can feel the exhaustion transform into relief and celebration, which is the emotional glue that turns isolated clips into a proper story arc. You don't just watch cars, you watch people who fixed, failed, and adapted together. And that's what makes the video linger in your head after it's done, even if you weren't a hardcore fan of the 812 specifically. Though a small gripe is that the pacing toward the end compresses a lot of follow-up details like the updates on the 296 and the Bugatti, which feel like they deserved micro-dedicated moments instead of being folded into the reunion, because the viewer who sticks around for 55 minutes would appreciate those deeper teases being honored with slightly more screen time. Finally, we close out with ski jump antics and that messy, joyous finale where the crew sends it and laughs about it. And I have to say, the ending encapsulates the whole video. Chaotic, tender, a little irresponsible, but undeniably fun. And here's my honest take. The video works because it balances three things most car channels either overplay or ignore: real mechanical detail, genuine friendships, and beautiful driving footage. And when those three line up, the result is gripping even if the production isn't perfectly polished. However, it does have weaknesses. Intermittent audio mixing, some shaky B-roll choices, and a couple of moments where more context about safety or recovery would have made it feel less cavalier. So should you watch it? Yes, absolutely. If you like cars with a side of human chaos, because this one gives you laughs, tension, technical tidbits, and a couple of heart-sinking moments that actually stick with you. And if you're watching for pure polish or a balanced, tutorial-style how-to, then maybe skip it. But if you want to feel like you were along for an unpredictable, slightly reckless mountain trip with mates who love cars, then this is exactly the kind of watch that'll make you smile and cringe in equal measure.
Just increasing rapidly, even though it was only 1 degree outside. So we had to get to